In the heart of Nairobi's noisiest food street, where matatas hooted like impatient geese and boda-bodas weaved through traffic, as if late for destiny, stood a small restaurant, painted in bold orange and green. Above it hung a proud wooden sign. Mama Africa's Kitchen, home of legendary Pilau. And legendary it was. Every day at exactly 11:47 a.m., Madame Africa would lift the lid of her giant sufuria. The moment the lid opened, the street changed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Arguments cooled. Even a pickpocket once forgot what he was doing, and just inhaled deeply. The aroma floated like a royal announcement. Cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, caramelized onions, garlic sizzling in oil, the scent of authority. People swore her pilau could heal heartbreak. Some claimed it restored failed relationships. One dramatic university student insisted it helped him pass economics. Madame Africa herself was a presence. Tall, graceful, wrapped in bright kiteng. Her laughter was deep and warm like a drumbeat. She stirred her pot with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. And right next door, trouble simmered. Next to the glorious chaos of Madame Africa's kitchen stood a quieter, more uncertain establishment. Mama Chiku's Delights. The paint was peeling slightly. The chairs creaked with insecurity. Her food? Not bad. Just forgettable. While Madame Africa's place overflowed with customers who argued over the last plate, Mama Chiku's customers sat quietly poking at their rice as if it had personally offended them. Mama Chiku noticed everything. She noticed how customers lined up before Madame Africa even opened. She noticed how delivery riders fought over who would carry her orders. She noticed how people said, "If it's not Madame Africa's pilau, I'm fasting." Her eye began twitching. Is it rice? Or is it sorcery? She whispered to herself one afternoon, while watching yet another wave of customers flood next door. The jealousy did not come loudly. It started small, like a mustard seed. Then it grew, and grew, until it had its own chair inside her heart. Mama Chiku decided she would uncover the secret. That very night, armed with a notebook titled Operation Pilau, Confidential, she crept behind Madame Africa's kitchen. She tiptoed so dramatically you would think she was auditioning for a spy movie. Through the half-open window, she saw Madame Africa alone in the kitchen, grinding spices by hand. Not rushing, not panicking, just humming an old tune while roasting cumin seeds in a dry pan. Mama Chiku scribbled furiously. Grind spices fresh? Hum while cooking? Stir clockwise? Smile mysteriously at pot? Suddenly, Madame Africa stopped humming. She turned slowly and looked directly toward the window. Mama Chiku nearly fainted. Had she been seen? Or did Madame Africa possess supernatural kitchen senses? Mama Chiku crawled home under the moonlight, heart pounding like a drum at a wedding. Desperation is a dangerous thing. It doesn't knock politely. It storms into your mind, rearranges the furniture, and convinces you that terrible ideas are actually brilliant strategies. By sunrise the next morning, Mama Chiku had convinced herself she was no longer jealous. She was strategic. She stood outside her restaurant pretending to rearrange tomatoes while secretly watching Madame Africa receive her usual delivery of spices, neat brown packets tied with string, carried by a skinny delivery boy named Kevin, who always looked slightly confused about life. Mama Chiku called him over sweetly. "Kevin, my son," she said, smiling wider than she had in months. Kevin blinked. Nobody had ever called him my son before. "Yes, Mama?" She handed him an ice-cold soda from her fridge, a rare treasure. His eyes widened. "For me?" "And more where that came from," she said smoothly. "In fact, I am expanding my business. I might need a permanent delivery manager soon." Kevin's chest expanded immediately. Manager. He liked the sound of that. Mama Chiku leaned closer. "I just need a small favor." She pulled out a spice packet from under the counter, one she had mixed herself at midnight in dramatic determination. She had thrown in extra cloves, a suspicious amount of rosemary, something that might have been crushed bay leaves. Even she wasn't entirely sure. "Switch Madame Africa's spice packet with this one," she whispered. "No one will know." Kevin hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he imagined his future managerial position. He nodded. Unfortunately, Kevin had the attention span of a mosquito in a disco. He carried both spice packets under one arm while answering a phone call from his cousin about football. By the time he reached the kitchens, he couldn't remember which packet was which. He stared at them. They looked identical. He shrugged. "Spice is spice," he muttered, and handed the wrong packet to the wrong restaurant. By 11:47 a.m., Mama Chiku stood proudly over her sufuria. Today was the day. Today the street would shift. Today customers would migrate. She lifted the lid dramatically. A strange, aggressive smell rose from the pot. It wasn't terrible. It was just confused. Very confused. There was cinnamon fighting rosemary, cloves shouting over something leafy. The rice looked slightly darker than usual, like it had seen difficult times. Mama Chiku hesitated. Then she squared her shoulders. "Confidence," she whispered to herself. "Confidence is seasoning." Lunch hour arrived. The first customer, a loyal man who usually complained about everything, took a seat. "Let me try pilau today," he said skeptically. Mama Chiku nearly laughed out loud. The trap was working. She served him generously. He took a large bite, chewed, paused. His eyebrows met in the middle. He chewed slower. The restaurant grew quiet. He swallowed carefully. "Why," he said slowly, "does this taste like forest?" The second customer tasted hers and immediately reached for water. "Did you cook Christmas decorations?" She coughed. "Is that pine tree I'm detecting?" Another man sniffed his plate suspiciously. "Madam, are we eating pilau or herbal medicine?" Within minutes, the murmuring grew louder than the street traffic outside. Meanwhile, next door, Madame Africa lifted her lid. The aroma that escaped was flawless. Balanced, rich, warm. The kind of smell that made strangers smile at each other. Customers who had just left Mama Chiku's restaurant wandered next door, confused but hopeful. One man whispered loudly, "I need to cleanse my mouth with the real thing." By 1 p.m., Madame Africa's queue had doubled. By 2 p.m., she had sold out. People were asking for takeaway for dinner. Back in her restaurant, Mama Chiku sat stiffly behind the counter. 3 plates of barely touched forest pilau sat abandoned on tables. Even the flies seemed uncertain. Kevin the delivery boy walked past and froze when he noticed the chaos. He sniffed the air, then sniffed again. His eyes widened in horror. He rushed to Madame Africa's kitchen. There, her assistant was staring at a spice packet in confusion. "Madam," the assistant said, "today's spice mix seems simpler than usual." Madame Africa tasted her pilau calmly. She smiled. "It's fine," she said gently. "Still good." Kevin's stomach dropped. He had done it. He had switched the wrong packages. Mama Chiku hadn't sabotaged Madame Africa. She had sabotaged herself. Kevin quietly disappeared before anyone could assign blame. Back in her empty dining area, Mama Chiku stared at the 3 abandoned plates. The rosemary leaf floated accusingly on top of the rice. Her shoulders slowly sank. All that plotting, all that whispering, all that dramatic midnight mixing. And the only thing she had successfully destroyed was her own lunch service. Outside, laughter and satisfied sighs echoed from Madame Africa's restaurant. Mama Chiku covered her face with her apron. For the first time, the truth whispered louder than her jealousy. Sabotage is like over-seasoning. It ruins the one who adds it. If you cannot beat the flavor, attack the reputation. That is the dangerous advice jealousy gives when it runs out of better ideas. After the forest pilau disaster, Mama Chiku stopped experimenting with spices. That battlefield had humiliated her enough. So she turned to something softer, something invisible. Words. They cost nothing. They travel fast. And unlike rosemary, you can't smell them coming. It started casually. A customer leaving Madame Africa's restaurant paused near Mama Chiku's doorway to adjust his belt because Madame Africa's portions did not respect waistlines. Mama Chiku leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You enjoy her food, eh?" "Very much," he said proudly. She nodded slowly. I just hope she reduces the oil. You know, too much oil is not good at our age." The man froze slightly. Too much oil? He hadn't noticed. But now that she mentioned it, later, she whispered to 2 university girls. "I heard she doesn't wash her rice properly. That's why it sticks so well starch." The girls exchanged looks. Starch? That sounded scientific enough to worry about. Then to a boda rider. They say she uses a secret ingredient from somewhere. She left the somewhere, hanging in the air like a mosquito buzzing near your ear at night. Rumors do not need full sentences. They need suggestion. Within 2 days, the street's energy shifted slightly. People still lined up at Madame Africa's restaurant, but now there were side eyes. Small murmurs. One woman whispered, "Do you think the oil is too much?" Another said, "My cousin's neighbor said something about her rice." The whispering grew, not loud enough to destroy, but loud enough to irritate. Until one bold customer, a middle-aged woman known for fearing absolutely nothing, pushed her way straight into Madame Africa's kitchen during lunch rush. "Mama," she said loudly, hands on hips. "People are talking." The entire kitchen froze. Steam hung midair. Assistants looked nervous. Madame Africa slowly lowered the heat under her sufuria. She wiped her hands on her kitenge apron. "Talking about what?" she asked calmly. "They say too much oil. They say unwashed rice. They say strange ingredients." The kitchen grew so quiet you could hear cumin seeds crackling in oil. Madame Africa did not defend herself. She did not roll her eyes. She did not storm next door. Instead, she smiled. "Come and see." She stepped aside. "Everyone who wants to see, come." At first, people hesitated. Then curiosity defeated caution. Within minutes, half the lunch crowd was squeezed inside her kitchen, standing shoulder to shoulder like they were attending a cooking concert. Madame Africa lifted a sack of basmati rice. "Step 1, she said clearly. "Respect the grain." She poured the rice into a large basin and filled it with water. The water turned cloudy instantly. First wash removes dust and excess starch. She drained it, filled it again, swirled gently with her fingers. Cloudy again. Second wash clears what the first missed. By the third rinse, the water ran almost clear. She lifted a handful of rice and let it fall back like white rain. Clean rice cooks separately. Each grain should stand alone, just like people. The crowd murmured approvingly. Then she moved to the spices. Instead of pre-ground packets, she placed whole cumin seeds, cardamom pods, cinnamon sticks, cloves, and black pepper on a tray. "These are not secrets," she said. She heated a dry pan, dropped in cumin. The seeds began to pop gently. The aroma rose immediately, nutty, warm, alive. She added cloves and cinnamon for a few seconds, just enough to awaken them. Spices must be toasted carefully. Too long, they turn bitter. Too short, they remain asleep. Someone at the back whispered, "This is like university." Madame Africa smiled. She ground the toasted spices fresh. The scent was deep, balanced, not aggressive, not confused. Then came the onions, thinly sliced. Into hot oil they went. The sizzling sound filled the kitchen like applause. She stirred patiently. "Oil is not the enemy," she explained. "Too much is. Too little is. Balance is everything." The onions slowly turned golden, then deeper, caramelized, not burnt. She added garlic and ginger paste. The fragrance intensified, rich and comforting. Even the skeptics leaned closer unconsciously. She measured salt with her fingers. Not guessing, not dramatic, just precise. Then the rice went in, stirred gently to coat each grain in spice and onion. The color developed gradually, a warm brown, even, and inviting. Finally, she added stock. Not plain water. "Flavor builds in layers," she said. She covered the pot and let it cook without unnecessary interference. No rushing. No panic. When she finally lifted the lid, steam rose in a perfect cloud. The rice was separate, shiny but not greasy. Each grain infused with spice. The meat tender and juicy. She fluffed it gently with a fork, not stirring aggressively. Respecting structure. "Now," she said calmly, "taste." Plates were passed around. The bold woman tasted first. Her eyebrows lifted slowly. "This," she said, chewing thoughtfully. "This is not too oily." Another customer nodded. "The rice is perfect." A boda rider laughed loudly. "If this is unwashed, then I don't want washed." Laughter filled the kitchen. Phones came out. Videos were recorded. Someone posted immediately. Madame Africa just opened her kitchen to prove haters wrong. Transparency level, 100%. By evening, the story had spread further than the rumor ever did. Customers praised her honesty. Food bloggers arrived. Even people who had never doubted her now trusted her twice as much. And next door, Mama Chiku watched the crowd grow larger than ever. She saw customers taking selfies with Madame Africa. She heard someone say, "That woman has nothing to hide." Mama Chiku dropped into a chair slowly. She stared at her own untouched stew. "How?" she groaned softly. "Does everything I do become advertisement for her?" She had tried spices. She had tried sabotage. Now, even rumors had turned into marketing campaigns. Across the wall, laughter erupted again as another batch of pilau sold out. And for the first time, Mama Chiku began to suspect something terrifying. The problem was not Madame Africa's reputation. It was her own hunger to destroy, instead of improve. And that realization tasted far more bitter than any spice she had ever misused. Now, frustration did not just simmer inside Mama Chiku. It boiled. It splashed. It stained the walls of her thoughts. She had tried spying. She had tried spice sabotage. She had tried rumors dressed as concern. And each time, somehow, Madame Africa came out stronger, shinier, more trusted, like cast iron, that only improves with fire. Mama Chiku stopped sleeping properly. At night, she lay awake, counting imaginary customers walking next door. 1, 2, 20, 50. Even in her dreams, she could smell pilau, not hers, that pilau. Finally, in a moment of dramatic exhaustion, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and marched to the far end of the market, where a roadside herbalist operated beneath a crooked umbrella. The herbalist sign read, "Solutions for all problems. Love, business, enemies, lost goats." He sat on a wooden stool, grinding something in a mortar. He looked less like a mystical figure and more like someone's retired uncle who had simply chosen a new hobby. Mama Chiku cleared her throat. "I need assistance." He looked up slowly. "What kind of assistance?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the tomatoes nearby might overhear. "I need her customers to vanish." The herbalist blinked. "Vanish how?" "Disappear, reduce, migrate, anything." He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached behind him and pulled out a tiny folded paper packet filled with grayish powder. "Sprinkle this at her doorstep at midnight," he said mysteriously. Mama Chiku's eyes widened. "That's all?" He nodded gravely. "But do not let it touch you." She paid him quickly, clutching the packet like forbidden treasure. That night the market was quiet. Shutters closed. Dogs barked in the distance. Mama Chiku crept out of her house dressed entirely in black, as if she were about to rob a bank instead of sprinkle powder. She reached Madame Africa's restaurant. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could wake the security guard 3 blocks away. She unfolded the packet. The powder shimmered faintly under the moonlight. "Goodbye, customers," she whispered dramatically. She sprinkled it carefully across Madame Africa's doorstep. Some blew into the air. Some settled on the ground. She brushed her hands together triumphantly. Then she walked back home feeling powerful for the first time in weeks. Finally, something would shift. She slept deeply that night for the first time in months. Around 3 a.m., thunder cracked across the sky. Clouds gathered aggressively. Wind howled down the street. Rain began, not polite rain, not gentle rain. This was the kind of rain that arrives with personal anger. It poured heavily, bouncing off rooftops, flooding gutters, sweeping dust, wrappers and mysterious powders down the street. The drainage system, which had never won any awards for excellence, overflowed immediately. By dawn, the entire street looked freshly washed. Mama Chiku woke up smiling. Today was the day. She hurried outside to check her masterpiece. And froze. A thick gray paste had collected directly at her own doorstep. The powder had traveled beautifully straight back to her restaurant. It clung stubbornly to her entrance, like unpaid rent. She stared at it. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Meanwhile, across the way, Madame Africa's doorstep was spotless. Cleaner than usual, in fact. Mama Chiku rushed inside, determined to ignore the omen. She turned on her stove. Click. Nothing. She tried again. Click. Silence. She checked the gas cylinder. Empty. Completely empty. "How?" she gasped. She had filled it just days ago. Her phone rang. It was her assistant. "Mama, I can't come today. My aunt's neighbor's cow is giving birth. It's urgent." Mama Chiku blinked slowly. "A cow. Yes, it is complicated." The line went dead. Mama Chiku stood alone in her dim kitchen. Outside, something even more painful was happening. The rain clouds parted. Sunlight streamed down in a single dramatic beam, and it landed directly on Madame Africa's restaurant, like divine endorsement. Customers began arriving early. Word had spread that Madame Africa was making extra special pilau today because the cool, rainy weather made it perfect comfort food. Steam rose from her sufuria like sacred incense. Laughter echoed. Someone clapped when the lid opened. A man shouted, "This weather and this pilau? We are blessed." Mama Chiku peeked through her curtain. The line stretched longer than she had ever seen. People held umbrellas, waiting patiently. Across the street, her own restaurant remained dark. The gray powder paste at her door now looked less mystical and more like embarrassment. She slowly walked back inside and sat on an overturned bucket. The silence in her kitchen was heavy. No sizzling onions, no clanging spoons, no chatter. Just the faint drip of rainwater from the roof. She stared up at the ceiling. Perhaps the universe had chosen sides. Or perhaps the universe simply did not support sabotage. Across the wall, she heard Madame Africa's warm laughter rise above the crowd. It was not mocking. It was joyful, and somehow that made it worse. Mama Chiku covered her face with her hands. Every plan she had crafted with secrecy had returned to her like a badly thrown boomerang. She had wanted customers to vanish. Instead, her own business was disappearing. And for the first time, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. Maybe the battle was never against Madame Africa. Maybe it was against her own bitterness. Outside, the smell of perfectly spiced pilau drifted once more through the air, rich, warm, unstoppable. And Mama Chiku sat in the shadows of her quiet kitchen, finally beginning to understand that no powder in the world could compete with patience, skill, and heart. Finally, pride shattered. Mama Chiku stormed next door. "What is your secret?" she demanded. The kitchen fell silent. Madame Africa lowered the heat gently and faced her rival. "No magic," she said calmly. She scooped a spoonful of pilau and handed it over. "Taste." Mama Chiku hesitated. Then she tasted. Her eyes widened. It wasn't overpowering. It wasn't complicated. It was balanced. Every spice in harmony. Every grain separate and proud. The meat tender. The aroma deep and comforting. It tasted like home. It tasted like care. Madame Africa spoke softly. "I wake up at dawn to prepare my spices. I taste every batch before serving. I treat each plate like it is for someone I love." Mama Chiku's shoulders dropped. All her schemes, all her drama, all her midnight missions. For what? The secret was not sabotage-proof magic. It was discipline, consistency, heart. The next morning, something shocking happened. Mama Chiku closed her restaurant. People gasped. Had she given up? No. She walked next door. "Teach me," she said quietly. Madame Africa smiled. Weeks passed. The street began to smell even better than before. Soon, a new sign appeared. Mama Africa and Mama Chiku, Pilau Queens. Customers now had double the seating, double the laughter, double the flavor. And Mama Chiku learned something powerful. Jealousy burns fast, but partnership feeds generations. On that busy Nairobi street, where matatas still argue and boda-bodas still race destiny, one lesson floats permanently in the air with the aroma of spices. You cannot steal greatness. You must cook it. Slowly, patiently, with heart, and maybe, just maybe, a little extra fried onion,